Venom. First villain and then anti-hero. Venom is one of the most intriguing and imposing characters in the MCU, and I don't think he's a character that requires much in the way of introduction. If you guys want to look up his backstory, it won't be hard to find on YouTube, so that's not going to be the focus of this video. Instead, I wanted to speak about the upcoming Sony Venom movie that will be coming out in Australia in October. It reminded me of a storyline that I've actually had kicking around in the back of my head for quite some time. And after seeing the trailers, I am not entirely convinced this is the Venom movie that I want to see. So, I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to hear my storyline and then go and see the new Venom movie when it comes out. And come back to me and tell me what you think. Which one worked better? So the problem that I'm finding lately with Hollywood in general, but also in Marvel, and Marvel are doing it better than most, but a lot of stories are very cookie cutter. They're following a similar formula. There's no real great surprises anymore in most movies. Let's take the trailer for Venom as an example. So you have Eddie Brock, who's this crusader type journalist, and he is looking into a rich industrialist who's somehow managed to acquire some very strange alien goo. Something goes wrong. Eddie gets infected with this new Venom symbiote and ends up having to defend himself and his girlfriend against the industrialist who wants to take control of the alien goo. Now, I think I could be very wrong here, but I think we all know where this is going. You know, it's going to end up with the rich industrialist allowing himself to become infected with an alien symbiote and probably ending up Carnage or Anti-Venom or something like that. It's not that much of a stretch of the imagination to see Marvel going that route. It would certainly be an acceptable one, but it's a little bit predictable. And that's the problem with Hollywood at the moment. They're just using these tried and true formulas, which don't exactly leave us with much in the way of originality anymore. My point is that, let's face it, Venom is a villain first and foremost. He was developed as a villain. Look at his appearance. The guy is intimidating. I wouldn't want to turn my back on him, even if I was Spider-Man or any other superhero. The guy is the stuff of nightmares. He's not some lethal protector. At least he didn't start out that way. And I think that any movie that involves Venom should reflect that. In short, I'm going to talk about using the Spider-Man movie as a vehicle to introduce Venom while keeping Venom more in the shadows, more of a concept rather than actually seen until perhaps the very end. Go for the slow burn and draw the audience in, get to know his character, get to know his backstory before we see the actual creature itself. So, without further ado, here's my script solution. Most of my younger audience wouldn't remember the 1984 Clint Eastwood movie Tightrope. It was a little bit before their time, I'm thinking, but anyway, more on that later. Look, I'm well aware of DC's attempt to darken their movies, and that hasn't really worked out very well for them, maybe with the exception of The Dark Knight and possibly Suicide Club as well. Those are movies that deserve to be dark. However, most of the DC lineup are simply not dark characters. They are more like gods among men. They are shining beacons of light in a dark universe. They are hope in a hopeless world. And as such, you can't really create dark movies surrounding these characters. On the other hand, Venom is a dark character, and he inspires dark storylines. So this is an opportunity, I believe, for Marvel to take this in a new direction, and it can go dark with Venom, I believe, and that's where I think Tightrope comes into it. It's an 80s style thriller about a strangler who stalks the streets of New Orleans murdering women. So Clint Eastwood is hot on the heels of The Killer, and this is where things get interesting. I chose Tightrope as my style of movie because I think it does two things that the Venom movie would actually need. First, it instills an unease of atmosphere by creating these dark, abandoned city streets, alleyways, underpasses. It takes what could normally be portrayed as a modern or a pristine, clean city, and definitely portrays it in a very murky and very forbidding way, which is like the perfect hunting ground for something like Venom. Secondly, it involves a good guy hunting a bad guy, trying to catch him by getting inside his head, which has been done successfully in other movies. It introduces a psychological element, and the idea that Peter Parker would have to examine himself, looking for a darker half of himself in order to understand something that he is hunting, something that might have similar powers to his own, I think is a really strong concept that we can deal with, and it certainly falls in line with the way that the comics actually went with the original Venom storyline as well. So, on to the script solution. We open with a woman being stalked on a New York street by an unseen attacker. Despite her best efforts to escape, she is killed. Jump back a year ago, we cut to Peter Parker, who awakes from a terrible nightmare. In it, he was hunting down criminals as he usually does, but in a much more menacing and predatory fashion. The morning headlines don't seem to pay much heed to the vicious acts we saw in his dream, but he does notice that one of the apprehended felons had to go to the intensive care unit at a local hospital. Unnerved but still in denial of his connection to the attacks, Peter contacts Tony Stark and asks him if any of the other Avengers were involved in the apprehension of the thugs from the previous night. Tony denies the Avengers' involvement, and Peter is left with the uneasy conclusion that it is he who has been carrying out the attacks. Fearing a personality disorder as perhaps the result of a head injury, Peter has himself checked out medically, undergoing a variety of tests, but still finds no explanation. That night, he suffers more dreams of violent attacks on thugs. The brutality of the incidents are increasing, and a headline search the next morning yields confirming results. With the help of his friend Ned, Peter performs a back search, looking for a pattern in the attacks. The pair discover that they have been going on for months, but the reports have been swallowed in the sea of felonies committed in New York on a daily basis. Ned manages to isolate the date where it began, and Peter tries to remember what happened that day, but strangely cannot. Ned recalls an explosion at an old disused hospital that the Avengers attended, Spider-Man included. Peter begins to feel faint and goes for a walk to clear his head. He suffers another nightmare, this one very intense, and wakes up in the ICU being tended to by Dr. Strange, who informs him that he has narrowly avoided an aneurysm due to some immeasurable strain. In the doctor's absence, Peter strikes up a limited conversation with his roommate and learns that it is the thug that was attacked mentioned in the paper. The thug denies that it was Spider-Man that attacked him and describes the assailant as a huge black monster. Dr. Strange performs the spell on Peter in private and reveals that he can only find the barest trace of something that was once within Peter. He concludes whatever it is has now gone. Months go by and all seems to have returned to normal when a serial killer begins striking down defenseless women. Iron Man performs patrols of the city when he can, but this conflicts with his other projects. A girl from Peter's school is killed, and Peter goes on the hunt. He intercepts the killer and corners him in a department store. The killer attacks Spider-Man, who is completely unprepared for the sheer inhuman abilities and savagery. Peter fights back and manages to escape, but is badly injured and shaken by his loss. His only clue is something the killer says: "Tell Eddie Brock to stop hiding behind others." Peter tries to track down this Eddie Brock, but his search leads to empty apartments of growing seediness. There are signs of inner turmoil, violence, and savagery with each hiding place, and Peter realizes that he is following a trail into someone's mad mind. Finally, he enlists Dr. Strange again to find Brock. When he does, Peter finds a broken man, very much like a junkie, sitting in an abandoned storeroom surrounded by dark, rotting webs. Brock admits to being the host of an entity known as Venom, an entity that at one time also bonded with Peter, hence his dreams. Strange unlocks the memory in Peter's mind, and together they view how Spider-Man investigated the explosion at the old hospital, saw Venom in its pure form, and became infected by it. Brock admits to both the terror and unquenchable hunger for the power of the symbiote, but laments that the creature abandoned him after he wound up in prison. Without the power and company of the symbiote, Brock has slid into a deep depression and lost his will to live. He convinces Peter that the symbiote of Venom just wants to live and has no desire to kill anybody, unlike his murderous offspring. He stresses that the real target of Peter's hunt should be Cletus Cassidy, a psychopath who was once Eddie Brock's cellmate. Peter enlists Eddie's guidance in identifying Carnage's preferred victims. The search takes the unlikely pair across the city to the site of each murder, and Brock explains the motivation of Carnage as opposed to Venom. It is here that we actually begin to develop a sense of empathy for Eddie Brock. While they search for a pattern, another girl from Peter's school is taken. Brock singles out Mary Jane Watson as a suitable subject for Carnage's attention, as she is a tomboy and seems to prefer to remain a loner. Carnage does indeed target Mary Jane, attacking her at an empty subway station. Spider-Man battles desperately to save her in a brief skirmish, during which Eddie is killed after being thrown beneath a train by Carnage, and Peter escapes with Mary by catching the same train and outrunning the killer. Later that night, Spider-Man stands guard at Mary's place, and she calls him Peter. He responds, blowing his secret identity, but Mary is more amused than amazed and kisses him. Carnage, meanwhile, though delighted that he has killed his parents' symbiote, breaks into Peter's school to find out his true identity. Using the school's database, he discovers Peter's home address and the name of his living guardian, Aunt May. When Carnage doesn't show for hours at Mary Jane's apartment, Peter starts to get a bad feeling due to his spider sense. He spots Iron Man performing one of his patrols and calls in a favor to watch over Mary Jane for the rest of the night. Tony is both bemused and flustered at becoming a babysitter, but agrees. Aunt May has been preparing to leave the airport while Carnage stalks her. Peter arrives in time to escort her, but Carnage attacks her at the airport when she tries to use the bathroom. Peter saves her, and the fight spills out into the middle of JFK Airport. Carnage is bigger, stronger, and has both the abilities of his parent and that of Spider-Man. Spider-Man is fighting a losing battle as he tries to direct the fight away from fleeing civilians. Just as all seems lost, Carnage is snagged by a wall of dark webbing. As he thrashes and twists to escape, Eddie Brock steps out of the shadows, still mangled from his injuries but nonetheless alive. When Peter expresses his disbelief, Brock smiles and says, "We weren't hiding, we were waiting." And with that, he transforms into Venom's true form. Spider-Man and Venom both attack Carnage, and though Spider-Man performs an effective supporting role, it is Venom who more equally matches his foe. The two symbiotes pound and tear at each other across the airport, carrying the battle onto the outside tarmac. The high-pitched whines of the jet turbines disrupts both symbiotes, causing them immense pain. But Spider-Man, who has used his webbing to safeguard his own hearing, uses it again to partially safeguard Venom, and Venom kicks Carnage into the turbine of a jet, ripping it apart and killing Cletus in the process. Spider-Man objects, but Venom insists that it was the man who was evil and killed the woman, not necessarily the symbiote. When Spider-Man turns to rebuke him, Venom is gone. Peter realizes that in stopping one monster, he has let another go. Returning to Mary Jane's house, he finds her waiting for him. Tony has fallen asleep on the couch, comically in full armor. Peter notices a patch of dark webbing on the balcony and realizes Venom has already been there, though for what purpose he is unsure, and before he can consider, Mary Jane kisses him again. The last shot is of the dark webbing quivering in the morning breeze. So guys, that was my take on a storyline to introduce Venom. I hope you liked it, and I certainly hope that you keep it in mind when you go and watch the new Sony vehicle when it arrives in October. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.